Christmas Eve in Charlotte was meant to glow with warmth. But the air in my daughter's house carried a sharp chill. The table stretched long and gleaming, polished as though it had never been touched by a meal before. At its head, I lowered myself into the seat that had once belonged to Arthur, my husband. Since his passing, I had taken that chair at every gathering. It was more than habit, it was a small anchor of belonging. Maris emerged from the kitchen, her heels striking the hardwood like a gavel. Behind her, Caleb hovered with a bottle of wine, and his mother, Beatrice, drifted in with a smile that never softened her eyes. I caught the flicker of calculation between them before Maris's voice cut the room. "Mother, you'll need to move." I steadied my hands on the tablecloth. "This has always been my seat." Her tone sharpened. "Brittle as glass. Not tonight. That place belongs to my mother-in-law." The laughter of my grandchildren stilled. Even Caleb seemed uncertain. Shifting his weight from foot to foot, Beatrice stood taller, saying nothing, as if waiting for the crown to be passed. I shook my head. "Arthur and I built this family. I will not rise for anyone." Maris's face hardened. All trace of the little girl I once carried gone in an instant. She came around the table, her palm flat against my shoulder, and with a sudden push sent me sprawling backward. Pain flared along my hip as the room gasped into silence. Jonah cried out. Grandma Eva froze with wide eyes. Caleb reached forward, then stopped, paralyzed by Beatrice's watchful presence. Maris's words fell like a sentence. "This seat is for my mother-in-law. Get out." I gathered myself, brushing dust from my skirt, my breath steady despite the fire rising in my chest. Leaning close enough that only she could hear, I whispered, "Careful, Maris. This house and your comfort sit on my signature, not his." I straightened, turned without another glance, and walked toward the door. The night air outside cut cold against my face, carrying me back to the farmhouse where my next move would begin. The farmhouse was dark when I returned, the December air following me through the door. My hip ached from the fall, so I settled into my armchair with a bag of ice pressed against the bruise. The sting steadied me more than it hurt. After a while, I rose and crossed to the cedar cabinet, where I kept what Maris and Caleb had long forgotten existed. From the back, I drew out a fireproof box, its metal surface cold against my palms. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt like memory itself. Inside lay the quiet truth of our family's scaffolding, the deed to this very farmhouse, the lien on Maris's gleaming SUV, the guarantee on their mortgage. Most damning of all, the folder marked Hollis Construction, my late husband's handwriting still visible on the margin. Arthur and I had co-signed Caleb's first equipment loan when no bank would touch him, and in return, we held 35% of the company, a share they paraded over but never truly owned. I spread the papers across the kitchen table. Their signatures looked bold then, but under my lamp they appeared fragile, almost childish. My hand drifted to the head chair at the table, Arthur's chair. I touched the worn wood and whispered, "I won't let them erase me. Arthur, not from this table, not from what we built." I pulled a notebook from the drawer and wrote 3 words at the top of a clean page. Boundaries and consequences, one by one. I began to list what would be withdrawn, what would be revoked, what would be remembered. The ice on my hip had melted to water, but the fire in me had only just begun to burn. The papers on the table pulled me backward through time, back to nights when I was younger but already weary. In the late 80s, when Maris was newly married, Arthur's lungs had begun to fail him. Doctor visits and hospital bills hollowed out our savings, but still, I took every extra tutoring job I could find grading papers at dawn, teaching evening classes, meeting restless students in coffee shops until midnight. I remember Caleb showing up one afternoon, hat in hand, saying no bank would lend him the money for a backhoe. His dream of starting Hollis Construction was slipping. Maris sat beside him, eyes wide with worry, still glowing with the naive pride of a new bride. I didn't hesitate. I wrote the first check, my own name steady across the bottom. Arthur signed too, though he could barely hold the pen through his coughing. Caleb clasped my hands, then, voice thick with gratitude. "You'll always have a seat at our table. Elowyn. Always." That promise had felt sincere. It burned now like acid. Arthur was gone within 5 years, leaving me to raise Maris through her last stretch of college, to bury our vacations and retirement plans, to carry debts in silence so she could walk into her marriage with nothing heavy on her shoulders. I thought that sacrifice might buy me respect. I thought it might teach her what loyalty meant. But Beatrice told another story. To Maris, Caleb's success was pure grit and ambition. She never knew the seed money came from the mother she just shoved to the floor. Beatrice made sure of that. My eyes lingered on the faded check stub tucked inside the folder. The ink was thinning, but the truth remained bold. The weapon I never meant to wield was waiting in my hands, and now I felt the weight of its sharp edge. I closed the box and slid it back. The notebook still open on the table, ready for the next name to be written down. By the time I drove back to the farmhouse, the world outside was wrapped in stillness. Christmas lights glowed faint in the distance, but the weight in my chest refused to soften. I set the fireproof box on the counter, locked the doors, and carried the phone with me to the bathroom, where even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The first call was to Ruth Delgado. We'd worked together years ago when I sat on the college board, and I trusted her steel mind. Her voice was rough with sleep, but when I explained, she came alert. Revoke the proxies immediately. I told her, every vote Maris casts in Hollis Construction on my behalf is withdrawn as of tonight. Ruth promised to draft the filings before sunrise. The second call was to Marcus Shaw, my accountant of 20 years. He'd seen me through Arthur's illness and knew where every dollar slept. "Freeze discretionary transfers," I said plainly. "Nothing moves from the family accounts without my signature." He hesitated, then asked softly, "Are you certain?" "Elowyn." I pressed my palm to the cold tile wall. I've never been more certain. The third call carried a different weight. Nora Benson, my colleague from teaching days, now ran the volunteer program at the community college. She answered with surprise. "But warmth, Nora. I'll need detailed records for upcoming service opportunities. Group projects, accountability sheets, everything." "I'll explain later." She agreed without pressing further. Before midnight, I left a message for the locksmith, instructing him to change the locks on the guest house behind Maris's property. It was still mine by deed, though she pretended otherwise. That illusion would end with a twist of a key. When the last call ended, I brewed a pot of tea and carried it to the window. Outside, frost gleamed across the fields. Silent and hard as glass, I lifted the cup, the steam fogging the glass pane, and whispered, "Tomorrow, silence will be louder than any shout." The notebook on my kitchen table waited open, its title stark: Boundaries and Consequences. The morning after Christmas. The air felt different, as if the storm had already broken though no rain had fallen. I knew Maris would wake into it before I even set my teacup down. By 7 o'clock, her mortgage auto-pay bounced. The bank sent its polite but sharp emails, the kind that carry both formality and threat. By 8, she was in a boutique, trying to buy herself solace with a designer scarf. Her card declined. Twice. The clerk smiled stiffly, but the sting landed. At 9, Caleb called her from the office, his voice stripped of its usual swagger. "The company accounts are frozen. Maris, payroll can't clear. Vendors are already calling." "What did you do?" She said nothing, because she didn't yet understand that I had done it. By 10, she drove past the guest house, where the locksmith's van sat in the drive. The locks had already been changed. She tried her key anyway, jamming it in the metal until her hands shook. It would not turn. By 11, her voice was cracking. She dialed my number again and again. Each call met with silence. 47 times she pressed the green button. 47 times the phone rang into nothing. At noon, I finally sent her a message. One line only 5 Church hall. Bring nothing but honesty. The children overheard her sobbing in the pantry. Jonah asked in a whisper, "Why is Mom crying?" Ava's voice followed, small but clear. "Did Grandma make her sad?" I set the phone down beside my teacup. The frost outside was beginning to soften under a pale sun, but the ice between mother and daughter had only just begun to harden. The church bell would ring in a few hours, and the ledger of respect would finally be read aloud. By the time the afternoon sun slid across the stained glass of the church hall, I knew words had already been exchanged in their house. I didn't need to hear them to imagine Beatrice's voice slicing through the rooms. "You let her humiliate us," she must have said, and I pictured Maris shrinking under the weight of it. Caleb, though, would have stood stiff, trying to steady the ground under his feet while the foundation crumbled. Later, I would learn how the truth had spilled. Caleb pressed Beatrice, demanding why she pushed Maris to take the head of the table from me. At first she parried, but pride made her reckless. "Because I will not share power with a ghost," she snapped. "No matriarch deserves 2 seats." Her words stunned him. He asked what rivalry she was speaking of, and she confessed to resenting me since the 80s, when Arthur and I were known for helping young contractors. She had wanted her name tied to Caleb's first success, but when the banks refused him, it was my check that carried the weight. That fact, she admitted, had always soured her. In that moment, Caleb's shoulders sagged. He saw it plain. The company he bragged of building on grit stood on the seed money of a woman his wife had shoved to the floor. Beatrice hadn't built him. She had only sharpened his arrogance. Maris's face cracked under the strain, torn between the mother who had carried her through every storm and the mother-in-law who promised her status if she obeyed. She wanted both crowns, but the mirror of Beatrice showed only borrowed pride. I sat at my kitchen table, the church bell tolling 5 in the distance, and waited for whichever version of my daughter would walk through the door. The church hall smelled faintly of pine and candle wax, its wooden floor creaking under my steps as I arranged 3 folding chairs across from me. The simple cross above the altar seemed to watch with quiet judgment. I sat with my hands folded, steady, waiting. The door opened with a groan. Maris came first, hair loose, eyes rimmed in red, her usual poise nowhere to be found. Caleb followed close behind, shoulders bent, carrying the weight of silence. Beatrice entered last, chin high, a scowl carved deep into her face. I rose, then sat again, motioning them forward. My voice was calm. "I have 4 conditions. They are not requests, they are the price of respect." Maris flinched, but I pressed on. "First, a public apology to me and to your children. They watched what happened. They will not carry that silence as truth." I lifted a paper from the table. "Second, every proxy right you hold in Hollis Construction is revoked. Effective immediately." Maris's lips parted, but Caleb surprised her. "I'll sign it," he said, taking the pen without hesitation. "Third," I continued, 6 weeks of community service at the college where I taught for 40 years. The records are already waiting. You'll learn there what service means." Maris's cheeks flushed. Shame or anger. I couldn't tell. "Lastly, Jonah and Ava will have unguarded time with me. No restrictions, no gatekeeping. They are my blood as much as yours." Beatrice let out a bitter laugh. "This is theater," she sneered. You've lost your place. Elowen. I met her gaze, steady as stone. This isn't revenge. It's reclamation. Caleb scrawled his name on the document. Maris stood, trembling, and shoved her chair back, without a word. She stormed toward the door, her footsteps echoing down the hall. I gathered the signed page into my folder, the air around me cool but clean, and waited for the storm's next turn. The papers Caleb had signed in the church hall moved quickly through channels, and within weeks the auditors began their review. What they uncovered made even my breath catch. Maurice had been preparing documents to shift a portion of Hollis Construction's shares into Beatrice's name. The maneuver was clumsy, but the intent clear. It was fraud, and if pressed, it carried the weight of a felony. Caleb stormed into my farmhouse one evening, eyes wide, skin pale. He dropped the file onto my table with shaking hands. "She nearly ruined us," he said, voice cracking. "The banks would have pulled every line of credit. Do you know what that means?" He didn't wait for me to answer, just paced the room like a man unmoored. I saw in him, for the first time, the realization that loyalty to Beatrice had been built on sand. I folded the file closed. "Then you know what must change." He nodded, defeated. When the dividend arrived, I refused to let it gather dust. Instead, I placed every cent into the Carver Scholarship Fund, designed for single grandparents raising children. The announcement ran in the paper with my name attached, not theirs. Meanwhile, whispers spread through Maris's circles. Women she once entertained at luncheons now leaned close over coffee cups. She stole from her own mother, they murmured, their sympathy thin, their judgment heavy. I didn't seek her humiliation, but the truth carried its own echo. The daughter who shoved me from a chair now found herself shoved from her own pedestal. And as spring thawed the last of the winter frost, I prepared for the next step, knowing some lessons require more than public shame to take root. By summer, the weight of consequence had pushed Maris into places she had never imagined. The community college cafeteria smelled of soap and boiled potatoes. And there she stood, apron tied crookedly, scrubbing trays while students passed by with muffled laughter. Some whispered her name, connecting it to the family company. Others just smirked, watching a woman who once lived for appearances bend her back in service. Nora kept a steady eye on her, patient but firm. One afternoon, as Maris fumbled with a stack of greasy pans, Nora said quietly, "Respect isn't inherited. It's practiced every day. You can't buy it, and you can't demand it." Maris didn't reply, but her hands moved more carefully after that. Months later, on a crisp October evening, Maris arrived at my farmhouse. Caleb waited in the truck, but she carried something heavy in her arms. I opened the door, and there it was, the carved dining chair I had fallen from on Christmas Eve. Repaired, polished, its joints strong again. She set it down gently in my kitchen. Her voice trembled. Where should this sit? I rested my hand on the back of the chair, tracing the smooth line where the wood had been split, where respect does. I said softly, beside me, not above me. Jonah and Eva burst in from the porch, throwing their arms around me, their laughter bright against the hush. Their embrace was more than comfort. It was recognition. A small chorus choosing sides without malice. Maris stood awkwardly, watching, as if unsure whether she was welcome in the circle she had once tried to break. I touched the chair again, feeling both the scar and the strength of its repair, and knew the final measure of our family would be decided at the next table we set together. A year passed, and Christmas returned, this time to my farmhouse. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and cider, the air filled with the steady hum of laughter. I had set the long oak table myself, each place card carefully written. At the head, I placed one with a single word in bold script, respect. Caleb carried dishes from the stove, sleeves rolled up, quieter than he used to be. The grandchildren darted between chairs, Ava sneaking olives from the tray, Jonah correcting her with a grin. Their joy wove the kind of music I wanted filling these walls. The last to arrive was Beatrice. She stepped into the doorway slower than before. The proud tilt of her chin softened into something closer to humility. She met my eyes, paused, then whispered, "I was wrong." Her hand trembled as she touched the back of a chair halfway down the table. She sat there without another word, the silence itself an apology. Dinner began, voices layering over each other, forks clinking against china. Between courses, Maris rose. In her hand was a brass key, old and familiar. She set it in the center of the table, its metallic ring cutting through the noise. "I'll knock from now on," she said, her eyes steady on mine. The room grew still until Jonah, sensing the weight, reached for another roll and broke the tension with a boyish grin. Laughter followed, but softer this time, more careful. I laid my palm on the carved chair beside me, the one I had fallen from, the one now repaired. Its wood was smooth, the scar still visible but strong. Leaning closer, I whispered to myself, "Chairs can be moved. Dignity stays anchored." The candles flickered, catching the gold of the spare key. And I felt the air shift towards something almost like peace.